The sky wept over Coyote Springs like God himself was in mourning, turning the dusty main street into a river of mud that April day in 1878. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking, trying to wash the whole miserable town right off the map. Leah Downey felt like she was about to be washed away with it. She huddled under the leaky awning of the general store, her thin cotton dress plastered to her skin, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather seeping into her bones. The stagecoach that dumped her here was a distant memory, and with it her last dollar and her last link to a world that made sense. This place didn't make any sense at all. She pulled a threadbare shawl tighter, watching the mud bubble and churn. "Ain't no use waiting it out, miss," a voice rasped from inside the store. "This one's set in for the day. Better find proper shelter." Leah gave a polite, practiced nod, the kind her mother had taught her for dealing with tradesmen in Philadelphia. But there was no shelter to be found. Not for her. The teaching position she'd crossed a continent for, the one promised in a crisp newspaper advertisement, was a ghost. A lie. There was no school in Coyote Springs. The shopkeeper had laughed when she'd asked. Laughed. Her trunk sat beside her, a coffin for her old life. Inside were her books, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the teaching certificate that now felt like a cruel joke. She was 22, an orphan, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. And that's when she heard it. The sound of hooves, not trotting, but churning through the thick mud. A massive black horse, slick with rain, stopped directly in front of her. On its back sat a silhouette, a tall man whose face was hidden by the wide brim of a sodden hat. "You'll catch your death out here," a deep voice rumbled, cutting through the drumming of the rain. "I'm quite all right, thank you," Leah replied, the words automatic, a useless shield of Eastern manners against this raw Western world. The man swung down from the saddle in one smooth, powerful motion. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out what little light was left in the sky. He moved closer, leading the giant horse. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and serious, "with all due respect, you're about as all right as a cat in a river." He stepped into the thin protection of the awning, and she could finally see his face, or at least the sharp line of his jaw covered in dark stubble. "Samuel Tucker. Folks call me Sam." He touched the brim of his hat, a formal gesture that seemed out of place in the mud and chaos. "Leah Downey," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I arrived on the noon stage. I was supposed to teach." Sam's expression, already grim, darkened further. "Jameson's advertisement." It wasn't a question. "You're the third one this year." He shook his head, a gesture of disgust. "That man ought to be horsewhipped." Before she could process what "third one" meant, he did something strange. He took off his hat, his dark hair already plastered to his skull by the rain, and held it out to her. "Take it. Keep your head dry while we figure something out." "I couldn't possibly," she protested. "You can and you will," he insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My mama would haunt me from the grave if she knew I left a lady sittin' in the rain." Reluctantly, she took the heavy, wet hat and put it on. It swallowed her head, the brim falling over her eyes, but it was an immediate shield from the relentless water. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker." "Sam," he corrected her. "Now there's a boarding house at the end of the street. Mrs. Calloway's a decent sort." "Might have a room." Leah's heart sank even further. "I'm afraid I can't afford lodging." A half smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not charity. It's neighborliness." He paused. "Besides, I've got business with her anyway." And with no more warning, he hefted her entire trunk onto his shoulder as if it were a bag of feathers. "Grab my horse's reins, would you? He's well-mannered." The horse, Thunder, nudged her hand gently. As she walked beside this stranger through the storm, his hat on her head while he walked unprotected in the downpour, a single chilling thought echoed in her mind. What happened to the other two? They trudged through the muck to a two-story clapboard building, a swinging sign creaking in the wind. Calloway Boarding House. Sam held the door, and the warmth that hit Leia was a physical shock. A plump woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair looked up from a desk. "Samuel Tucker, you're dripping all over my clean floor," she scolded, but her tone was fond. Then her sharp eyes landed on Leia. "And who might this be?" "Miss Leia Downey," Sam said, setting the trunk down with a solid thud. "Another victim of Jameson's false advertisements." Mrs. Calloway's expression hardened. "That scoundrel. He ought to be run out of town on a rail." She came around the desk, her gaze sweeping over Leia from head to toe. It wasn't a kind look anymore. It was an assessment, an appraisal. "I'm Martha Calloway, dear. You look half drowned." "Miss Downey needs a room," Sam continued, "and possibly work. She can pay once she's found employment." "And you're vouching for her?" Mrs. Calloway's eyes narrowed, shifting from Leia to Sam and back again. "I am," Sam said, his voice firm. The older woman nodded, a silent transaction passing between them that Leia couldn't decipher. "That's good enough for me. As it happens, my arthritis is acting up. I could use help with the cooking and cleaning." Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over Leia. "I'm a hard worker, Mrs. Calloway. I'd be most grateful." "It's settled, then," the woman said, her smile returning, but it still didn't seem quite real. "Room at the top of the stairs, first door on the right." Leia turned to Sam, holding out his hat. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker. You've been exceedingly kind." He took it, his fingers brushing hers. "Just being neighborly, Miss Downey." But something flickered in his eyes, a warning or a plea. She couldn't tell which. He promised to bring by some beef the next day, and with a final tip of his dripping hat, he was gone, disappearing back into the storm. As the door closed, leaving Leia alone with Mrs. Calloway, the woman's kind demeanor vanished like a puff of smoke. "Let's get one thing straight, girl," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious whisper. "Sam Tucker vouched for you. That means you're his responsibility. But you're in my house now, and in this town that means you answer to me. Don't you forget it." The next few weeks were a blur of hard labor. Leia rose before the sun, her hands quickly growing rough from scrubbing floors, kneading dough and washing the heavy linens of the boarders. 3 grim-faced miners, an ancient storekeeper who watched her with rheumy eyes, and a jumpy young telegraph operator who never spoke a word. The work was honest, but the atmosphere in the house was not. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. The boarders exchanged glances she couldn't read. Mrs. Calloway was a fair boss, but she was also a warden, her eyes following Leia everywhere. She learned about Coyote Springs in snippets. It was a silver town, but the only person who seemed to have any money was the mysterious Mr. Jameson, the man who owned the mine, the saloon, and, it seemed, the soul of every person in town. "And Mr. Tucker?" Leia asked one afternoon, trying to sound casual as they shaped loaves of bread. "Has he been here long?" Mrs. Calloway's hands didn't stop their rhythmic punching of the dough. "Sam came about 6 years back, bought a patch of worthless land, and turned it into the best cattle operation in the territory. The man works like he's trying to outrun the devil himself." She paused, her eyes distant. "Keeps to himself, lost his wife and baby back in Texas. That's why he came west." Lia's heart ached for him, but Mrs. Calloway's next words sent a chill down her spine. "She died in childbirth, they say. A terrible thing. Just terrible." The way she said it, the slight emphasis on "they say," made it clear there was another story. A story she wasn't telling. But before Leia could ask, the woman changed the subject, her tone brisk and final. Sam Tucker arrived like clockwork every Wednesday with a delivery of fresh beef. His visits were the only break in the oppressive silence of the boarding house. He was polite, reserved, his conversations with Leah brief and formal, yet she often felt his eyes on her when he thought she wasn't looking, a heavy, searching gaze. On her third Wednesday, Mrs. Calloway was conveniently gone, visiting a sick friend. Leah was alone in the kitchen when Sam arrived. He set the wrapped package on the table, the air in the small room crackling with unspoken words. "Good afternoon, Miss Downey," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm to settle accounts," she replied, her hands trembling slightly as she counted coins from the cash box. He didn't just stand there. He occupied the space, his quiet strength making the room feel tight, airless. "You're settling in?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face, looking for something. "Yes, thank you," she said, handing him the coins. "Mrs. Calloway has been most kind." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Martha is many things. Kind isn't usually the first word that comes to mind." He hesitated, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "I hear you're an educated woman, a qualified teacher." "I am," she confirmed, a spark of her old pride returning. "Why?" His gaze met hers, direct and intense. "Some of my ranch hands have children. 8 youngsters. They have no schooling." Lia's heart gave a painful lurch. This was it, the reason she'd come west. "Would you consider teaching them? I could convert an old bunkhouse, provide supplies, a fair wage." The offer was a lifeline, a sudden blinding ray of hope. "I would be delighted," she exclaimed. A real smile finally broke through his grim expression, transforming his face. "Come out to the ranch this Sunday, see the place, meet the families." Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. "I'll be going then." As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Mr. Tucker, Sam, thank you for helping me that first day." He paused in the doorway, his back to her. "You were sitting alone in the rain," he said, his voice flat. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she whispered. "You did." He stood there for a long moment, then left without another word. As the door swung shut, Leah noticed something on the floor where he'd been standing. A small folded piece of paper, dropped from the brim of his turning hat. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. Scrawled in rough pencil were 3 words: "Trust no one." Sunday dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm clouds gathering in Lia's mind. Trust no one. Did that include him? Did it include Mrs. Calloway? She wore her best blue dress, a fragile armor of respectability. After the brief church service where Sam stood in the back, his eyes never leaving her, she found him waiting with a wagon. The hour-long drive to his ranch was a strange mix of pleasant conversation and unbearable tension. He pointed out landmarks, his voice calm, but his hands gripped the reins so tightly his knuckles were white. The Tucker Ranch was more than he'd described. It was a fortress, a sturdy 2-story house, well-maintained outbuildings, and strong corrals, all nestled in a valley that felt a world away from the oppressive watchfulness of Coyote Springs. 3 families were gathered near an old bunkhouse, the parents looking nervous, the children unnaturally quiet. Their clothes were clean but threadbare, their eyes wide and fearful. Sam introduced them, and Leah made a point to learn each child's name, but they flinched when she smiled. They weren't just poor. They were terrified. "Miss Downey's considering teaching your young ones," Sam announced, and a flicker of something, hope, maybe, passed through the parents' eyes. "Every child deserves an education," Leah said, the words feeling hollow, rehearsed. The bunkhouse itself was clean, but the windows were set high in the walls, almost like a prison, and on the inside of the heavy door Leah saw it, a thick iron bolt, not to keep people out, to lock them in. "I'll send to Prescott for whatever books you need," Sam said, watching her face, gauging her reaction. "You've given this considerable thought," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Children need learning," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "It's the only thing no one can ever take from you." After the families scurried away, he showed her the main house. It was clean, masculine, filled with books. In the parlor, a dusty piano stood silent. "My wife, Elizabeth, used to play," he said, his voice tight. Leah felt a pang of sympathy, but his note burned in her pocket. Trust no one. Was his grief real, or was it a story, a performance for her benefit? He asked her to play, and she did, a simple, sad tune her mother loved. When she finished, he was watching her with an expression of such raw pain it almost broke her heart. Almost. He drove her back to town under a sky full of stars. The silence in the wagon was thick with everything they weren't saying. As they pulled up to the boarding house, he helped her down, his hands strong on her waist. "This means a great deal to the families," he said. His eyes pleaded with her. "Help me." Leah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this wasn't about reading and writing. This was about something else entirely. She was being recruited for a war she didn't understand. "I'll start on Monday," she said, her voice steady. As she walked to the door, she knew she had just accepted the most dangerous job of her life, and turning back was no longer an option. The school was a lie. Leah knew it from the first day. The children, Tommy, Rebecca, and the others, were not just uneducated. They were broken. They moved with a listless exhaustion, their small hands calloused and scarred. They knew their letters, but they jumped at loud noises and hoarded scraps of bread in their pockets as if they expected to starve. 3 days a week, Sam or one of his silent, watchful ranch hands would collect her in the wagon. The journey was always the same, a tense, quiet ride out to the ranch, where she would enter the fortified bunkhouse and try to coax words and smiles from children who seemed to have forgotten how. They weren't learning arithmetic. They were learning to be children again, and it was a slow, painful process. Leah became a fixture at the ranch, but not a friend. The women were polite but distant, their eyes filled with a shared, secret sorrow. They were prisoners, all of them, living under Sam Tucker's protection. But protection from what? Or from whom? She and Sam developed a strange, cautious relationship. They would talk for hours, sharing books, debating politics, everything except the one thing that hung between them: the truth. She saw glimpses of the man underneath the armor, a dry wit, a deep intelligence, a profound sadness. But every time she felt herself getting close, the wall would go back up. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve, a man of violent contradictions. One afternoon she found him in the barn, expertly stitching a deep gash on a calf's leg, his hands both gentle and strong. The next, she saw him staring out at the distant mountains, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip, his face a mask of cold fury. Summer bled into a crisp, golden autumn. Leah had made progress. The children were beginning to laugh. Little 6-year-old Tommy had even started holding her hand. One Saturday, after the other families had gone, Sam asked her to ride with him to check on a newborn calf. He gave her a gentle mare named Daisy, and they rode out under a vast blue sky. For a few hours they were just a man and a woman, enjoying a beautiful day. They reached a hilltop overlooking the valley, the cattle grazing peacefully below. "Do you miss the city?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not the crowds, not the judgment. Here, at least, I'm needed." "You are," he said, and the way he looked at her made her breath catch in her throat. On the ride back, the sky turned on them. Dark clouds boiled up over the mountains, and a cold wind whipped through the valley. The first drops of rain hit like pebbles, and within minutes a full-blown thunderstorm erupted. Sam helped her down from her horse and pulled her under the shelter of a massive oak tree. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled of leather and rain and him. They stood close, the roar of the storm isolating them from the rest of the world. "Reminds me of the day we met," Leia said, her voice shaking slightly. "You were a sorry sight," he chuckled, a low, warm sound, soaked to the bone. "And you shared your hat," she whispered, looking up at him. His smile faded. His gaze dropped to her lips. The air grew thick, heavy. He leaned in, his name a rough whisper on his lips. "Leia." And then a deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead. The moment shattered. Sam flinched back as if he'd been struck, a look of guilt and panic on his face. He turned away, his voice suddenly cold and distant. "Storm's moving fast. We should go." The ride back was silent. The wall between them was higher and thicker than ever. At the boarding house, he helped her from the wagon with formal, impersonal courtesy. "Good night, Miss Downey." He didn't use her first name. He was a stranger again, and as he drove away, leaving her standing alone in the dark, she finally understood. He wasn't just hiding a secret. He was hiding from her. For the next 2 weeks, Sam Tucker vanished. One of his ranch hands, a man named Jeb with eyes that had seen too much, came to collect her for school. When Leia asked where Sam was, Jeb just grunted, "Business. In Prescott." But Leia knew it was a lie. He was avoiding her. The ranch felt different without him. The quiet watchfulness had been replaced by a tense, nervous energy. The women cast furtive glances toward the road. The children were more subdued than ever. Leia felt his absence like a physical wound. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on his steady, if mysterious, presence. "That man is as stubborn as a mule," Mrs. Calloway declared one evening, noticing Leia's melancholy. Leia had finally broken down and told her about the thunderstorm, about Sam's sudden retreat. "He's fighting his feelings," the older woman said, her eyes surprisingly soft. "He thinks he's being disloyal to Elizabeth's memory." "His feelings?" Leia asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mrs. Calloway snorted. "Don't play coy with me, girl. I've seen the way he looks at you, like a man dying of thirst looks at a spring. But he's wrapped up in his grief. Some wounds. They take a long time to heal." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they only confused Leia more. The grief felt real, but so did the secrets. Which one was the truth? Was he a grieving widower, or something else entirely? A man who put iron bolts on the inside of schoolhouse doors, a man who wrote cryptic warnings on scraps of paper. The confusion was eating her alive. She was living in a town of whispers, working for a man of secrets, and falling for a ghost. She felt like she was back under that awning in the rain, only this time the storm was inside her own head. November brought a biting frost and a sense of impending doom. Leia was helping the children rehearse a Thanksgiving recitation when the schoolhouse door burst open. It was Jeb, his face pale, his chest heaving. "Fire," he gasped. "At the Dawson place. Everyone's needed." The Dawsons, a quiet couple with 3 small children in her class. Their homestead was 2 miles away, isolated. "Go," Leia told the frantic parents who had gathered. "I'll keep the children safe here." For hours she held the terrified children, telling them stories, singing songs, her own heart pounding with a cold, sickening dread. This wasn't an accident. In Coyote Springs, nothing was an accident. Late in the afternoon, a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. It was Sam. His face was black with soot, his shirt was singed, and there was a long, bloody cut over his eye. "The fire's out," he announced, his voice raw with exhaustion. "The house is gone, But we saved the barn and the livestock. No one was hurt. A collective sigh of relief filled the small room. While the children rushed to their parents, Sam walked slowly toward Laya. His eyes, clear and blue in his soot-stained face, were locked on hers. "The Dawsons will need a place to stay," he said quietly. "I've offered them the old foreman's cabin. It needs work." "I'll help," Laya said immediately. "Whatever they need." A small, weary smile touched his lips. "I knew you'd say that." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking straight into her soul. "I've missed you, Leia." The simple words undid her. "I've been right here." "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I've been a fool." He glanced at the remaining families, then back to her. "Could you stay, after the others leave? I need to talk to you." When they were finally alone, the little schoolhouse felt vast and silent. Sam stood by the blackboard, looking not like a powerful rancher, but like a lost boy. "I owe you an apology," he began. "I've been avoiding you." "Why?" she whispered, though she was afraid of the answer. He ran a hand through his soot-caked hair. "Because I'm falling in love with you," he said, the words raw, torn from him. "And it terrifies me." Laya's breath hitched. Before she could speak, he held up a hand. "Please, let me finish." He took a shaky breath. "When Elizabeth died, a part of me died with her. I came here to disappear. I built this ranch to work myself to death. I hired men with families so there'd be life around, a life I didn't have to be a part of. And then you showed up." His eyes burned into hers. "You walked out of the rain and brought the sun with you. You've brought light back into this place, Leia. You made the children laugh again. You made me feel again." "Why does that frighten you?" she asked softly. "Because loving someone means I can lose them," he said, his voice cracking. "And I can't go through that again. Not here. Not in this town." He finally looked away toward the high, barred windows. "And because I wasn't sure you could return the feelings of a man like me. A man with so many secrets." "What secrets, Sam?" she pressed gently. "What is happening in this town?" He turned back, his face a mask of anguish. "The advertisement you answered, the fire at the Dawsons. They're not random. They're messages from Jameson. He owns the silver mine, but he needs workers, cheap workers. The ads are a lure. The accidents are a warning. The families on my ranch, they're not employees, Laya. They're fugitives. They're indebted to Jameson, trapped. I've been getting them out, one by one, giving them a place to hide." The pieces clicked into place, the fear in the children's eyes, the bolt on the door, the constant watchfulness. "And your wife?" Laya asked, her voice trembling. "Elizabeth." His face crumpled. "She was the first teacher. She wasn't from the East. She was a local girl. She figured out what Jameson was doing, that he was using orphans from back East as slave labor in the deepest, most dangerous parts of the mine. The children I have now, they're the ones she managed to save before." He couldn't finish. "She didn't die in childbirth, did she?" Laya whispered. He shook his head, a single tear tracing a clean path through the soot on his cheek. "Jameson found out what she was planning. He staged a wagon accident, made it look like she was fleeing. No one in town would question him. He owns them all." Laya crossed the room and took his rough, calloused hand in hers. "He doesn't own me," she said, her voice fierce. "And he doesn't own you." Hope, fragile and fierce, dawned in his eyes. He cupped her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. "May I kiss you, Laya Downey?" "I wish you would," she whispered. His lips met hers, a kiss of shared grief, of desperate hope, of a love forged not in peace, but in the heart of a coming war. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Leia," he said, his voice urgent. Not for love, not yet. Marry me for protection. As my wife, Jameson won't be able to touch you. It will give us time. Time to finish what Elizabeth started. It wasn't the proposal she had ever dreamed of. It was something more. It was a vow, a pact, a declaration of war. Yes, she said, without a moment's hesitation. Yes. They were married 2 days before Christmas by a traveling preacher in the ranch house parlor. Mrs. Calloway stood as a witness, her expression unreadable. The ranch families were there, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Leah wore a simple dress, and Sam looked devastatingly handsome in a borrowed suit. But the colt at his hip was a stark reminder that this was not a fairy tale. It was a strategy. Their marriage was a shield. Sam moved her things from the boarding house to the ranch that afternoon. The house was big, filled with the ghost of another woman. As Sam carried her trunk into the master bedroom, his bedroom, Elizabeth's bedroom, an awkward silence fell between them. "You can take this room," he said quickly, gesturing to the large bed with its handmade quilt. "I'll move into the guest room down the hall." Leah nodded, her heart aching. This was the right thing to do, the safe thing to do. But it felt wrong. They were husband and wife, but they were also partners in a conspiracy, soldiers sharing a foxhole. The intimacy of their kiss felt a lifetime away. The next few weeks were a strange dance of domesticity and danger. Leah ran the house, cared for the children, and slowly, carefully began to earn the trust of the ranch families. Sam ran the ranch, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a rifle never far from his hand. At night, they would sit on opposite sides of the fireplace, reading or talking quietly. The empty space between them a chasm of unspoken feelings. Leah learned more about Elizabeth. She found her sheet music in the piano bench, her delicate handwriting in the margins of books. She wasn't a ghost, she was a presence, a martyr whose legacy they were fighting to uphold. And Leah found herself not jealous, but inspired. One night, a fierce blizzard swept down from the mountains, isolating the ranch completely. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows. Leah couldn't sleep. She went downstairs to find Sam sitting by the dying fire, staring into the embers, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. He looked up as she entered, his eyes haunted. "I can't stop thinking about her," he confessed, his voice thick. "Especially on nights like this. She loved the snow." Leah sat in the chair opposite him. "Tell me about her," she said softly. And so he did. He talked for hours about their childhood friendship, their young love, her fierce courage. He told her how Elizabeth had used her teaching position as a cover, documenting Jameson's crimes, smuggling children out of the mine right under his nose. She had compiled a ledger, a detailed account of every child, every injury, every death. Proof. She hid it, Sam said, his voice breaking. "Somewhere safe. The night she died, she was on her way to tell me where, but she never made it." He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the whiskey bottle. "I've searched everywhere. Her things, the schoolhouse, our favorite places. Nothing. Without that ledger, it's my word against Jameson's, and my word is worth nothing in this town." He finally looked at Leah, his eyes raw with despair. "I led you into a hopeless fight. I put your life in danger for a ghost." "It's not hopeless," Leah insisted, her mind racing. "She was a teacher, Sam. She thought like a teacher. Where would a teacher hide the most important document of her life?" They sat in silence, the only sound the howling of the wind. Leah thought about her own books, her most prized possessions. She thought about the comfort of a classroom, the smell of chalk and old paper. Elizabeth was smart. She wouldn't have hidden it somewhere obvious. She would have hidden it in plain sight. "Sam," Leah said, her voice trembling with a sudden, electrifying idea. "The old bunkhouse, the one we use as a school, was that her classroom too?" He nodded. "Yes, we cleaned it out for you, but it's the same place." "Take me there," she said, standing up. "Now, Laya, it's a blizzard. Now, Sam." He saw the look in her eyes and didn't argue. They bundled up and fought their way through the blinding snow to the small, dark schoolhouse. Inside, the air was frigid. Laya held a lantern high, her eyes scanning the room. The blackboard, the simple benches, the high windows. It was all just as she'd left it. "I've searched this place a dozen times," Sam said, his voice flat with defeat. "You searched it as a rancher," Laya said, her heart pounding. "I'm looking at it as a teacher." Her eyes fell on the blackboard. It was a large slate framed in heavy oak. She ran her hands along the frame, feeling for a loose board, a hidden catch. Nothing. She tapped on the slate itself. Solid. Then she looked down. The chalk rail. It was a simple piece of wood, but it was thicker than it needed to be. She ran her fingers along the underside, and there, tucked deep in the back, her fingers brushed against it. A small brass latch. With a click, the bottom of the chalk rail swung down on a hidden hinge, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thin, leather-bound book. Elizabeth's ledger. Sam stared at it, his face pale in the lantern light. He reached out a trembling hand and took it, opening it with a reverence that broke Laya's heart. Page after page of neat, precise handwriting detailing Jameson's atrocities. Names, dates, injuries. It was all there. The proof that could set them all free. He looked up at Leah, his eyes shining with tears. "You found it," he whispered. "She led you to it." In that moment, the space between them vanished. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him, his face buried in her hair. "Laya," he breathed, his voice choked with emotion. This time there was no hesitation. His kiss was not one of strategy or protection. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, a kiss that had been held back for far too long. He lifted her into his arms and carried her out of the schoolhouse, back through the storm. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the ranch house that night, the only storm was the one they created together. They were no longer just partners, they were husband and wife. And now they had a weapon. The ledger changed everything. It was a bomb waiting to explode, and they had to be careful with the fuse. Jameson was powerful, but he wasn't invincible. His weakness, Sam explained, was his ambition. He craved legitimacy. He was trying to get the railroad to build a spur line to Coyote Springs, a move that would make him one of the most powerful men in the Arizona Territory. To do that, he needed the approval of a federal judge, Judge Miller, who was known for being a stickler for the law and was scheduled to visit the nearby town of Prescott in the spring. "If Miller sees this ledger," Sam said, his finger tapping the leather-bound book, "Jameson is finished, but we have to get it to him, and we have to do it without Jameson finding out." Their plan was simple and dangerously bold. They would use the upcoming town Founders Day festival as a cover. Everyone would be distracted. Sam would ride for Prescott with the ledger, while Laya and the ranch families created a diversion. The weeks leading up to the festival were the most tense of Laya's life. She and Sam lived on a knife's edge, playing the part of happy newlyweds for the benefit of anyone who might be watching, while secretly planning a revolution. The love that had sparked in the storm had deepened into a powerful bond, a quiet understanding that passed between them in shared glances and brief touches. They were a team, and their shared purpose made their connection unbreakable. Laya, the city girl who had arrived helpless and alone, discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She organized the women, coached the children, and became the calm center of their small rebellion. She taught the children a series of songs and recitations for the festival, innocent on the surface, but filled with coded messages of hope and freedom. The morning of Founders Day arrived, a perfect, cloudless day. The entire town was gathered in the main street. Jameson was there, preening like a king, giving a grand speech about progress and prosperity. Leia saw him look over the crowd, his cold eyes lingering for a moment on her and the children from the Tucker Ranch. A shiver of fear went through her, but she met his gaze without flinching. As Leia led the children onto the makeshift stage, it was the signal. From the corner of her eye, she saw Sam, dressed not as a rancher but as a simple traveler, slip away from the edge of the crowd and mount his horse, which had been hidden in a nearby alley. He carried the ledger in a secret pocket sewn into his saddlebag. He gave her one last brief nod, and then he was gone. Leia took a deep breath and turned to the children. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Let's begin." The children were magnificent. They sang their songs with a passion that brought tears to the eyes of their parents. They were no longer the broken, fearful creatures Leia had first met. They were defiant. As Rebecca, the oldest girl, began her final recitation, a poem about a caged bird learning to fly, Leia saw a flicker of movement near the saloon. One of Jameson's thugs was talking to another, then pointing down the road, in the direction Sam had gone. They knew. Her blood ran cold. The man was running, heading for the stables. Leia had to do something. She had to buy Sam more time. Thinking fast, she stepped forward as Rebecca finished her poem. "And now," Leia announced, her voice ringing out across the suddenly quiet square, "for a special treat. Young Tommy Dawson has learned a new song, a tribute to our town's founder, Mr. Jameson." Jameson looked surprised, then pleased, his ego stroked. Tommy, a small boy who had been terrified of his own shadow just months before, looked at Leia with wide, questioning eyes. She gave him a tiny, encouraging nod. The plan had been for the program to end, for them to slip away in the ensuing applause. This was improvisation. This was chaos. Tommy walked to the center of the stage, took a deep breath, and began to sing. But it wasn't a song of praise. It was a simple, heartbreaking melody about a little boy who works in the dark and never sees the sun. A song Elizabeth had taught the first group of children she had rescued. A song of the mines. A hush fell over the crowd. The townspeople, the ones who lived under Jameson's thumb, looked at each other, their faces pale. Jameson's smile froze, then twisted into a mask of pure fury. He understood the words. He understood the accusation. He started to rise from his seat, his face purple with rage. "Stop him!" he bellowed at his men. But it was too late. The story was out. The secret was sung. And in that moment of shocked silence, Leia heard it. The distant but unmistakable sound of a steam whistle. The train, a train that wasn't supposed to arrive until the next day. Chaos erupted. Jameson's thugs pushed through the crowd, heading for the stage, but the townspeople, the miners and shopkeepers who had lived in fear for so long, stood their ground. A dam of resentment had broken. Fights broke out. The festival dissolved into a brawl. Leia grabbed Tommy's hand and pulled the children off the stage, shielding them as the women from the ranch formed a protective circle around them. Through a gap in the crowd, she saw the train pulling into the station. And stepping off the first car wasn't Judge Miller. It was a full contingent of U.S. Marshals, armed with rifles, and leading them, sitting tall on his horse beside the tracks, was Sam. He hadn't ridden for Prescott. He had ridden for the telegraph office in the next town over. He had wired Judge Miller directly, and the judge, sensing the urgency, had commandeered a train. Jameson saw them. He saw the marshals, saw Sam, and he knew the game was over. He turned and ran, trying to get to his horse. But Mrs. Calloway, the quiet boarding house owner, stepped out of the crowd and calmly tripped him with her cane. He went sprawling into the mud, the same mud that had greeted Leia on her first day in town. A marshal cuffed him as Sam dismounted and walked toward Leia, the precious ledger in his hand. He didn't stop until he reached her, pulling her and the children into a fierce embrace. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. It's finally over. Looking over his shoulder, Laya saw the faces of the townspeople. The fear was gone. In its place was something she hadn't seen in Coyote Springs before. Hope. The trial of Harrison Jameson was swift. With the ledger as evidence and the testimony of the families Sam had sheltered, he was convicted of slavery, kidnapping, and murder. His assets were seized, the mine was placed under federal control, and for the first time in years, the people of Coyote Springs could breathe free air. The town began to heal. They built a real schoolhouse, a beautiful building with big windows and a proper bell. Laya was, of course, its first official teacher. Sam Tucker, once the town's mysterious outsider, became its reluctant leader, helping to form a new town council. The ranch was no longer a fortress, but a home, filled with the sounds of laughter. The Dawsons rebuilt their house, bigger and stronger than before. One evening, a year after the festival, Sam and Leah sat on their porch, watching their daughter, Hope Elizabeth Tucker, take her first wobbly steps in the grass. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of purple and gold. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Laya asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The rain, the mud. I was so lost." Sam wrapped his arm around her. "You weren't lost," he said, his voice soft. "You were just waiting to be found." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a gold locket. He opened it. On one side was a tiny, perfect portrait of their daughter. On the other, a miniature painting of the ranch. "For you," he said, fastening it around her neck. He pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a tender kiss. The ghosts of the past were finally at rest. They had taken a town built on secrets and lies, and rebuilt it with courage and truth. Their love story wasn't a simple romance. It was a revolution, born on a day when a lonely cowboy shared his hat with a woman sitting alone in the rain, and together they decided to fight back against the storm. What they built in Coyote Springs became a testament to the idea that even in the darkest of places, a little bit of light, a little bit of courage, can change everything. Their story, and the story of the town they saved, is a reminder that you never know what kind of hero you can be until you're called upon to act. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption in the Old West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of history's hidden heroes.